She married a simple ranch hand. He was an Irish nobleman in hiding from an assassin. The ring was in my boot. Not on my finger, not in a box, not hanging on a cord around my neck the way some men carry a dead wife's token. In my boot, wrapped in oilcloth, pushed down against the inside of my left ankle where the leather was starting to rot through. I'd been meaning to get new boots for 6 months. I kept not doing it, and I think I knew why, though I wouldn't have said so then. The ring was my father's, his father's before that. A gold signet, heavy enough that you knew it was there, a crest on the face of it that I won't describe because if I describe it, someone might know it, and that was the whole problem. That ring, that crest, that name, they were the reason a man named Corcoran had followed me from Queenstown to Liverpool to New York to a rooming house in St. Louis, where I woke one night to the smell of lamp oil and had maybe 40 seconds before the place caught. I went out the window in my shirt and stockings, left everything. The ring I had in my pocket, luck or instinct, I couldn't tell you which. That was 3 years before I came to the Malone Ranch. My name, as far as anyone in the Wyoming Territory was concerned, was Declan Ward. Not a lie entirely. Ward was my mother's name, and Declan was what she called me before my father's people got hold of me and turned me into something more formal, more Latin, more suitable for a man who would one day inherit 4,000 acres of County Clare, and a house that had been standing since before the American colonies existed. I was that man. I want you to understand that clearly because the story doesn't make sense unless you understand it. I had been educated in Dublin and then in London. I spoke 3 languages. I had read Cicero in the Latin and argued philosophy with men who thought they were very clever. I knew which fork to use at dinner, which was more important to some people than you'd think. I had stood in a room with lords and members of Parliament and held my own. And by the autumn of 1882, I was mending fence line on a cattle ranch outside a town called Garnett, Wyoming, for $30 a month and found, and I was grateful for it. You do what you have to do, that's not a complaint. Malone's spread was decent-sized, not a cattle empire, not a struggling scratch of dirt either. Thomas Malone had built it up over 20 years and then died of a heart seizure while loading hay, the way a lot of men in that country died, working. He left it to his daughter, Nora, and a foreman named Briggs who was honest but old and whose knees had given him trouble since a horse came down on him in 1879. Nora Malone was 28 years old and had been a widow for 2 years. Her husband, a man named Calloway, had gone up to the North Range one November and not come back. They found him in the spring thaw. The way people talked about it, carefully, with that particular quiet that means nobody wants to say what they're thinking, I gathered there were questions about how he ended up where he did. But Nora never spoke about it, and I never asked. She ran the ranch. That was the first thing I noticed, not her face, not anything like that. The way she ran the thing. She was up before first light, and she knew the state of every pasture gate and water trough on the property. She kept the books herself. She could read a cow's condition at 30 yards, and she could tell you which hands were worth keeping, and which ones were passing through and spending their wages before they earned them. Briggs introduced me when I arrived. I'd heard of the place in town, heard they were hiring on. She looked at me for a moment, not long but thorough, like she was pricing something. "You've worked cattle before," she said. It wasn't a question. "I have," I said. "Where?" "Texas, and before that, further east." She let that sit there a moment. She was deciding something, I could tell. Then, "The south pasture fence needs 3 days of work minimum. You do that first and do it right, and we'll talk about what comes after." I did it in 2.5 days. I did it right. I want to tell you about the hiding. I want to tell you what it costs, because that's the thing people don't understand when they hear a story like this one. They think it's romantic, maybe, a man of rank working with his hands, disguised, living simply. What it actually is a slow erosion. Every conversation you have, you're editing, choosing, watching yourself. A man makes a remark about something he's read, and you catch yourself before you answer the way you'd naturally answer, because a ranch hand who's read the same book is a ranch hand who has questions to answer. You see something done badly, a poorly calculated thing, a decision that'll cost money or time, and you hold your tongue because it's not your place. Over months and then years, you learn to make yourself smaller than you are. Not in a cowering way, just contained. You fit yourself into the shape of the thing you're supposed to be, and after a while you forget what the original shape felt like. That's the dangerous part, not the man hunting you, the forgetting. Corcoran, I'll tell you about him now, since you ought to know the whole of it. He was a hired man himself, but of a different kind. In Ireland, in certain circles, there are old grudges that wear suits and send letters through solicitors. My father had won a legal case, years before I was born, that stripped another family of a land claim they'd held informally for decades. The family had declined and scattered by the time I came of age, but one of them, a cousin, second or third, I never entirely worked out the degree, had neither declined nor scattered. He'd prospered quietly at work that didn't bear examination, and he decided, somewhere along the way, that the debt my father's victory had created should be paid in a particular kind of currency. My father died when I was 24. The attempts on my life began when I was 25. There were two of them in Ireland, one in London, and then I ran. I ran because there was nothing else to do. I had no proof that would satisfy a court, no allies willing to take on the kind of money that was behind it, and a solicitor who told me, delicately, that the most prudent course was to be somewhere I wasn't known for a period of time. A period of time, that was 1879. It was now 1882 and I'd heard nothing. But hearing nothing is not the same as it being over. A man who hunts patiently doesn't announce himself. So I kept to myself. I did my work. I was Declan Ward ranch hand. The thing that started the unraveling was a letter. I'd been on the Malone Ranch 8 months by then. I'd gone from the fence work to general ranch labor to something that sat between ordinary hand and something else. Briggs's knees had gotten bad enough that certain things fell to me by default, the kind of thing that requires judgment as much as muscle. I was careful about it. I didn't push. I let it come to me. The letter arrived at the post office in Garnet, addressed to a name I hadn't used in 3 years. It came care of a Denver banking concern that had been forwarding my cousin Riordan's occasional letters. Riordan was the only person in the world who knew where I was, roughly, and the only person I trusted with even that much. The man at the post office handed it over without ceremony. I stood on the boardwalk in the October cold and read it. Corcoran was in America. Riordan had heard it from 2 separate sources, men who moved in the kind of circles where such information circulated. He was in New York but asking questions. He'd found the St. Louis Trail. It was a matter of time. I stood there long enough that a woman coming out of the dry goods store asked if I was all right. I told her I was fine. I walked back to the ranch thinking about where I'd go next. I didn't tell Nora. That's the thing I want to say plainly, because later she would ask me why, and the answer matters. I didn't tell her because she wasn't supposed to be a part of it. I was a hand on her ranch. She was my employer. Whatever had developed over those 8 months, the ease I felt around her, the fact that she talked to me like I had a brain, the way she'd started asking my opinion about things she didn't need to ask my opinion about, none of that changed what the arrangement was. She had a ranch to run and a life to live, and the correct thing for a man in my situation was to pack what he had and go. I packed my things. I'd accumulated very little: a spare shirt, a second pair of trousers, the oilcloth-wrapped ring, a few books I'd bought from a man passing through who was selling off everything he owned. I put it all in the saddlebag. I told Briggs I had to go, that it was a family matter. Briggs looked at me. He'd never asked me much about myself, which was one of the things I appreciated about him. He just said, "That's a shame." I went to say goodbye to Nora. She was in the barn. She had a lamp and she was looking at one of the horses, a gray gelding that had been off his feed for a week. She didn't look up when I came in. "He's not worse," she said, "but he's not better." "You should have Eckhart look at him," I said. Eckhart was the man in town who knew animals. She looked up then. She read my face the way she read everything, directly, without softening it. "You're leaving?" "I have to go, it's not the work." She waited. She was good at that, at just letting silence sit until a person filled it. "There's something from before that's caught up with me," I said. "I'd rather it didn't catch up with me here." "Something dangerous?" "Possibly." She set the lamp on the stall door and folded her arms and looked at me for a long moment. I remember the light. Yellow, moving a little from the draft under the barn door, throwing shadows up the side of her face. She had her hair loose. It was late. She'd been about to turn in when the horse had gone off again. "You're not going to tell me what it is," she said. "I don't think that's fair to you. And leaving without an explanation, that's fair." I didn't have an answer for that. She said, "There's something I want to ask you, and I want you to answer me honestly." All right. What you actually are, what you were before this. Because I've watched you for 8 months, and you are not what you say you are. I'm not saying that as an accusation. I'm saying it because I think you know it and I know it, and we've both been polite about it long enough. I sat down on a hay bale. I don't know why it wasn't a considered thing. My legs just decided we were sitting. I told her all of it. The estate in Clare, the legal case, the family and their hired man, the attempts in Ireland, London, the rooming house fire in St. Louis, the running, the 3 years of being Declan Ward. The ring came out of the boot. I showed it to her. She held it in her palm and looked at the crest in the lamplight for a long time without saying anything. When she gave it back, she said, "And now this man knows you're here, more or less." More or less, I'd rather he found an empty ranch than a full one. She nodded slowly. Then, "How long would you need to stay somewhere until it was resolved?" "I don't know. It might not resolve. It might be a thing I live with the rest of my life." Another silence. She picked up the lamp from the stall door. "Go unpack your saddlebag," she said. "Nora, I'm not asking you to stay and be a hero. I'm not asking you to face him here. I'm saying, go unpack your saddlebag, sleep on it, and let's talk in the morning about what makes sense. You've been alone with this for 3 years. One more night of not being alone with it won't kill you." I unpacked the saddlebag. What came after that happened in the way of things that feel later like they were inevitable, even though at the time each step seemed like a decision. We talked in the morning, and the morning after that. Somewhere in those conversations, she made me understand that she had no intention of letting me disappear into the territory and go back to eating out of a tin by a different creek in a different county. The way she said it wasn't soft. It wasn't a speech about love. She laid it out practically, the way she did everything. Two people who trusted each other, who'd been useful to each other, who ran a ranch well together. The rest was its own business. We were married by a circuit preacher in January. I want to be clear about something. I have never in my life been proposed to by a woman. She did not propose to me, it wasn't like that. What it was a conversation that arrived somewhere, and we both knew where it had arrived, and neither of us was inclined to argue. The thing that struck me, lying awake the night before the preacher came, was that she knew. She knew what I was and who I'd been and what I was carrying, and she chose it anyway, not despite it, the whole of it. That had never happened to me before. I have moved in rooms where my name opened doors. I have been invited places and deferred to and told I was a fine figure of a man and all the rest of it, and nearly all of it was about the name and the land and the weight of that gold ring. There was one woman in Dublin. I'd thought about her sometimes in the lean years, but even she, I knew, was thinking about County Clare. Nora Malone did not know about County Clare when she watched me work for 6 months and started asking my opinion. She knew about a man named Declan Ward who could read a fence line and keep his head when the cattle spooked, and who didn't talk more than he needed to, and who did what he said he'd do. That's what she'd made her mind up about before she knew the rest. I thought about that a great deal. Corcoran found the ranch in March. I'd known something was coming. You develop a feeling for it after a while, the kind of alertness that isn't quite fear. I'd been watching the road, checking things I didn't need to check. Briggs had noticed and kept his own counsel about it. The day he came, I was in the south pasture and Nora was at the house. She sent the boy who helped in the kitchen, a 14-year-old named Eli, out to find me. Eli rode hard and said there was a man at the door who'd asked for me by a name he'd never heard. The name he'd never heard was my full name, my real one. I told Eli to go to the bunkhouse and stay there. I rode back across the pasture at a pace I didn't want to draw attention to. Corcoran was still on the porch when I came around the corner of the house. He was younger than I'd imagined. I'd built him up in my head into something larger over 3 years. He was a plainly dressed man of about 40, the kind of face that doesn't stay with you. He had his hand in his coat. Nora was in the doorway, not hiding, not retreating, standing in her doorway with her arms at her sides and the door behind her closed, and she looked at me once when I came around the corner and then back at him. "This is my husband," she said to him. "This is his ranch. You'll want to say your business." I heard what she did there. My husband, his ranch, 2 sentences that put a shape around something. Corcoran looked from her to me. Whatever he'd expected, it wasn't this. "I'm not going to tell you there was a gunfight. There wasn't, not that day and not that week." What there was a conversation that Corcoran didn't enjoy, one that made certain things clear. That I was not a solitary man running and could be quietly disappeared. That there were people who knew my name and where I was and who I was married to, and that the consequences of any action he took would not be as tidy as whoever sent him had calculated. A man who hunts in the dark does not want to be seen. He left. He came back twice more over the following year, each time less certain. The third time he left a letter with the postmaster and didn't come to the ranch at all. The letter told me, in the language of a solicitor, because he'd been sent by solicitors, in the end, that certain matters were resolved, that a legal agreement had been reached, that I was free to correspond with a Mr. Hugh Tivnan in Dublin regarding the estate. I read the letter twice. I folded it and put it in my breast pocket and went in for supper. I told Nora that night after. She read the letter herself. She'd become the kind of person who needed to verify things, who didn't take summary for the whole story. When she'd read it, she set it on the table between us and was quiet for a moment. "So you could go back," she said. "I could. To Ireland, the estate, the house. I could." She met my eyes. "Is that what you want?" And the thing was, and I want to be clear about this because it still surprises me a little even now, the thing was that it wasn't. What I wanted was in this room. What I'd been looking for without knowing I was looking for it was right here in a ranch house in Wyoming, sitting across a table from me with a letter between us. 3 years of being smaller than I was, contained, fit into the shape of another man, and somewhere in it I'd become more myself than I'd been at home, than I'd ever been. "I want to write to Tivnan," I said. "I want to understand what the estate is now, whether there's anything left that needs to be dealt with, and I want you to come with me if we go, as what you are." She looked at me for a moment. "What am I?" "My wife," I said. "And the reason I'm still here." She reached across and turned the letter face down. Then she reached across a little further and put her hand on my forearm. Just that. Just her hand, warm and certain, pressing down for a moment so I could feel the weight of it. "Write your letter," she said. We did go once. Dublin in the autumn of 1884, Nora had never been east of Pittsburgh, and she stood at the rail of the ship the whole crossing, watching the water, completely herself about it. No performance of wonder, no manufactured awe. Just watching the way she watched everything. The house in Clare was in better shape than I'd feared and worse than I'd hoped. The land was there. The tenants had managed as tenants do when nobody is watching, which is to say better in some ways and worse in others. There were things to be settled, accounts and repairs, and a dozen conversations with men in stiff collars who were not quite sure what to make of Nora. She was not interested in their uncertainty. She asked practical questions. She read documents they offered her and asked where the unclear language was. One of the solicitors told me afterward, in confidence, with a peculiar mixture of admiration and bewilderment, that she was the most clear-headed woman he had met. He meant it as a compliment. It was. "I want to tell you about the evening we walked the land. The house sits on a rise, and the pasture falls away below it in the way Irish land does, that green that doesn't have an equivalent, that light that comes sideways in the afternoon and makes everything quiet and old-feeling. I'd grown up on it. I'd thought during the worst years that I'd lost it for good. We walked to the lower field and stood there in the October light, and Nora put her hands in her coat pockets and looked across the valley for a while. "It's very beautiful," she said. "It is. I can see why you'd grieve it." That's all she said about it, just that she could see why I'd grieve it. Not what a lesser person would say, not the reassurances or the commentary on what I should feel, just the plain acknowledgement. She could see it. I took her hand out of her coat pocket and held it, and she let me, and we stood there until the light changed. We came back to Wyoming. I want you to understand why, because people did ask, when they eventually understood more of it. Why would a man with an estate in Ireland and a title he was entitled to come back to a cattle ranch in Wyoming territory? Here's what I know. I know that in County Clare I was a name and a history and a set of obligations and expectations that had been stacked on me before I was old enough to have opinions about them. I know that in Wyoming I had become a man that a woman I respected had chosen on the merits, not the name, not the land, not the ring. The work I'd done and the person I actually was. You don't give that back up. Not if you have any sense. The ranch is larger now. We bought the Hendricks parcel in '86 and the Cray water rights the year after. Briggs retired finally about 3 years ago and is living in Garnet in a house we helped him into because it was the right thing to do. Eli, the boy, is 22 and one of the better ranch hands I've ever worked with, which I told him, and which he took in the way young men take that kind of thing, which is to say he stood a little taller and then went back to work. The ring is in a box in the bedroom now, not in a boot, not hidden. Nora found a box for it, a small cedar one she got from a woman at the church who makes them. She put it on the dresser when we came back from Ireland, and I've never asked her why exactly. I have a sense of it. The same sense I have about why she stood in her doorway that morning and said my husband, his ranch, because she was making a thing plain, not to me, to the world. I've never been a man for speeches. You can probably tell that from the way I'm telling this, it comes out sideways in pieces, not in order. But if you want to know what it was, finally, to have someone look at you with full knowledge, the titles and the flight and the lie and the boots with the ring in them, and say without any fuss, yes, this is mine. I'll tell you what that's worth. It's worth 3 years of fence work and cold, and eating alone and running from your own name. It's worth more than that. There's a photograph we had taken in Cheyenne, the second year we were married before the trip east. We're standing outside the studio and she's got her hand through my arm and she's looking at the camera the way she looks at everything directly, like she's already decided and isn't troubled by it. I look like a man who doesn't quite know what to do with where he's standing, which is probably accurate. I look at that photograph sometimes. The man in it had been worn down to something he didn't recognize anymore and didn't know it yet, and was about 4 months from a woman who would see the actual thing underneath and decide it was worth the whole trouble. I look at him and I think, you're all right, Ward. You're going to be all right.